I think we're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here for the penultimate Craft of Teaching event, co-sponsored by CCT. So thank you very much, CCT, the Chicago Center for Teaching, for all of this hard work and helping us pay for the lunch and pay for everything. I just want to make a quick announcement. There's one last upcoming Craft of Teaching event here at the Divinity School. When American Religion goes digital, pedagogical innovation in the teaching of American religion. That'll be on May 24th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. All the information you need about it is on the Divinity School's website on the Craft of Teaching page. So we have an extraordinarily exciting event today. It's been a long time coming, not just in sort of the year's preparation, but also in general. I don't think this is a seminar that Craft of Teaching has ever done before, but it's something that is, I think, near and dear to all of our hearts. I think all of us will at some point in time find ourselves in a pedagogical context where the audience doesn't seem particularly inclined to listen. And so the purpose of today is to provide some practical tools and advice for negotiating and succeeding as a teacher in a distracted classroom. So, basic structure. There are two facilitators, Jim Lang and Yoel Jacobs. Jim Lang will begin with a talk, as you can see here, and I'll have Joseph Lambert from CCT introduce him. Then there will be a 10 to 15 minute break, and then we'll come back together for an interactive sort of workshop where, sorry, let me turn my page, there we go, where the insights that we have gained from the talk will be put into practice. So it should be very entertaining, both first and second half. So without further ado, please help me welcome Joseph Lambert, who will introduce Jim Lang.
Great. Can you hear me like this? Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor James Lang. I also would like to thank the Craft of Teaching program for organizing the event. So James Lang is Professor of English and the Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he teaches courses in British literature and creative nonfiction writing. He's the author of several books on teaching and learning, including Small Teaching, Everyday Lessons from the Science of Learning, which I think is one of the best books on teaching and learning written in the last few years, so I very much recommend it. Professor Lang also writes a monthly advice column for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and he edits a series of books on teaching and learning in higher education for the University of West Virginia Press. And since I know we have some literature folks in the audience, the most recent one of that, I believe, is the New Approaches to Teaching the Literature Survey, which he is a co-editor on, which just recently came out. So please join me in welcoming Professor James Lang.
Well, do I need to use it or can I do what you did?
Can everybody hear?
I'm going to talk like this. Can you hear me if I talk like that?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me here. This is a subject that I'm very interested in. I'm sort of slowly working my way toward a research project on this subject. So it's wonderful to be able to kind of share these ideas and get some feedback and enjoy what the discussion will be like. So I first became interested in this subject a few years ago, actually. I had a student, I was teaching British Literature Survey 2, which is the course I teach most frequently. It just sounds exciting, doesn't it? It's a great course, but it needs a name update. So in British Literature Survey 2, I had a student who sat in the front row every class period. She was a terrific student. She was one of my best students. She was excellent. And she sat in the front row. She always did the reading. She always came to class. But sometimes I could tell she wasn't quite all there. Now, she sat in the front row, so as a result, I could see she was not on her device. Her desk was right in front of me. I could see there was nothing in her lap, because I tend to wander up and down the rows a little bit. So, this was sort of a mystery to me, why this student might have been occasionally distracted, even though I could see no devices or any other distractible things near her. So one day I'm teaching, and I kind of wander down the aisle right next to where she's sitting, and something catches my eye, like a little flash of light. And I looked down and I saw that she had her phone sitting in her purse, face up, so that she could see notifications. She wouldn't respond to them, but she would look down occasionally to see if there was anything interesting happening on her phone. Now, this really struck me because this was one of my best students. She was a future teacher. She was someone who did all the work and actively participated in class, and yet the lure of that phone was still so strong that she couldn't. And I, unlike what I'm going to do today, which I'm mostly going to talk at you and then see what kind of questions and conversations. In class, I tend to run a very kind of active classroom where there's a lot of stuff going on. So, in spite of all that, the lure of that phone was very strong. So, that got me interested in just kind of thinking about, okay, how deep does this problem run? What is the sort of context and history behind it, and what can we do about it? And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Email was kind enough to let me kind of start by giving a kind of historical and contextual overview. And then we'll take our break, and then she's going to do the kind of more active part of this. So what I'm really going to do here is just kind of present you three things. And first we're going to think a little bit about the history of this. And so is this in fact a new problem? Is the idea of distraction something that's especially problematic for us now at this moment in time? The second thing we're going to do is we're going to just look sort of briefly into the biology of it. What does the sort of neuroscience and biology tell us about how, why, when we get distracted, what we're distracted by, and how we recapture and lose attention. And the third thing we'll do then is just think for a few minutes about education and about what the implications of this are for our students and for education. So that's what maybe like a half dozen slides or so on each of these things. And then I'll see what kinds of questions that you have. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just kind of begin with a little bit of history. And thinking about what does the history tell us about this subject matter. Paul North is a philosopher who wrote a book about distraction from a sort of philosophical perspective. And North sort of, I think, provides us with a nice starting point here. That as long as we have been wanting to pay attention and viewing attention as a goal for us in terms of our thinking, we have been worried about distraction. So this actually is a very old and persistent problem in our thinking. So as long as we've been doing this as the kind of idealized version of thinking, this sort of unifocal attention to a single subject, that means as long as we've been viewing that as our ideal, attention in fact has been a problem for us. And so in fact, as we're going to see in just a few minutes, as far back as we can go in terms of people talking about thinking and cognition, we have been seeing that, and I would like to say there's kind of two fundamental premises here that we see in almost everybody's writing about sort of the mind and distraction and attention. These two premises are, we have in fact always been distracted for as long as we've been writing about the mind. And the second premise is, we've always been sort of unhappy about it. So from the earliest days of people writing about attention and focus and distraction, we've been sort of in complaint mode about it. So that kind of gives us an interesting starting point, first of all, in terms of historical context. Now, North locates the beginning of this in Aristotle, actually, and argues that, of course, for Aristotle, the goal of the sort of pinnacle of human achievement and human existence was sort of thinking and reflection upon the good life, right? And sort of working together in cooperation with one another politically to help achieve that good life. So that means for Aristotle, the kind of directed focal thinking that we associate with attention was fundamental. That was a kind of fundamental premise. If we wanted to be able to achieve that good life, as Aristotle outlined it, we need to be able to have that capacity to pay attention, and it needs to work. So North kind of identifies within Aristotle just a few kind of moments, kind of shudders or hesitations in which Aristotle recognizes there is this other thing that happens with our minds when we either are kind of drawn away or these moments of not thinking. And so he's, according to North, Aristotle kind of approaches these moments and then backs away from them because they are such a kind of represent such a fundamental challenge actually to his ultimate philosophical project. So kind of we can go all the way back to kind of the ancient Greek philosophers here to catch this first wind of the idea that distraction is something that's troubling our way of understanding our own minds. Now, more appropriate perhaps here for the divinity school, right? We can get to so we get to our ancient religious texts as well, and we see here in one of our sort of most famous passages from Luke the idea that very early on, and by the way, for each of these slides, I'm going to try and show you a quote, but I want to make each of these quotes is designed to show us something specific about our sort of history and thinking about distraction. So what Aristotle did initially was to kind of set up this binary. Right? So this binary between attention and focus versus distraction on the other side. And that binary is continued. Okay, so that's where we kind of get the starting point of this conflict between attention or non-attention, essentially. And of course, we don't have to think about our minds that way. There could be other ways to conceptualize the cognitive process without putting it into these two sort of binary categories. But we get that process started with Aristotle. So here we then encounter our first kind of, it's our first encounter with the fact that distraction has a kind of moral quality to it. And that attention and focus, they both are viewed as a kind of positive thing that we want to achieve. And that distraction is sometimes maybe something that we can't help, but sometimes it's a kind of moral failing for us to be distracted. Now here there's a little bit of slippage between the sort of cognitive distraction versus distraction by being like, deciding to pay attention to other things or kind of, deliberately pushing your focus around to multiple things here. But we see in the passage that the better part here is to sit and focus and pay attention, right? And the sort of lesser part is to have yourself being distracted by multiple things. And so that, as we're going to see, continues throughout, actually, the history and people's talking and thinking about distraction. There is a kind of moral quality, moral inferiority associated with being distracted, or distracting yourself, or distracted pursuits are less serious than pursuits of work, or study, or prayer. All these things are considered to be the better part. Okay, so in the 17th and 18th centuries, as you may know, coffee house culture arises in Europe. And coffee house culture is a huge part of kind of where the sort of intellectual kind of people coming together and both socializing but also doing a lot of kind of intellectual work. And there's a lot of creativity going on in these coffee houses that kind of spread all throughout Europe, especially prominent in Britain. And as coffee house culture arises in Europe, and people, sort of flock to these coffee houses to do intellectual work, to meet with one another. Learned societies arise from coffee houses. Journals that we still have today, actually, some of them arose in coffee houses as people were kind of gathering there together doing work. But from the earliest coffee houses as well, concerns arise about their distracting potential. So when people go to coffee houses, first of all, one thing that's happening is they're distracting themselves from the work that they should be doing. And then the second thing that happens is that when you go to a coffee shop, you're subject to this sort of constant buzzing around you, which makes it difficult for you to pay attention. And so that's something that we see here in this quote, right? Who can apply close to a subject with his head full of the din of the coffee house? So when the coffee house comes together, kind of all the negative parts of distraction. So we see people flocking to them, and then we see equally people reacting strongly against it. And it's strikingly similar language to the language that we see about distraction today. Now, one interesting thing here, in William Wordsworth, right, who's writing about, this is in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads that William Wordsworth, in early, this version of it in 1802. And what I want to point out about this one here, in which Wordsworth is again kind of saying, things are changing, it's impossible for us now to really focus and pay attention given the sort of information. Of course, now we're talking about the rise of newspapers. We're talking about railroads as well. And so kind of the exchange of information and people. And this too is kind of also, putting increasingly people in cities. The craving for extraordinary incident, which the rapid communication of intelligence gratifies, are newspapers and pamphlets. Right? So as those are kind of sort of growing exponentially. Wordsworth here is again complaining about this idea. But what I want to note about this one is this. And this is also a trope that has sort of continues throughout the literature, which is, it's new. This is happening now. This is the result of some novel change that we are experiencing that is like nothing else we've experienced before. So this is going to continue. I won't show quotes from this, but as with each new technology that arises, including the telegraph, the radio, television, computers, the internet, phones, each of these things kind of reanimates this trope, in which it's the idea is this is something completely new, and this new thing is hijacking our attention or causing distraction in ways that haven't yet happened in the past. So we see that here starting with Wordsworth, and that will continue as well. Another thing that you see throughout the literature is that distraction is associated sometimes with both gender and race. And so distraction actually from much earlier than this quote. This is from a novel called Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield. It was published in the early 1930s. It was so successful she published a whole bunch of diary of ladies doing this and that, right? This main character. And you see in this novel, she attends a literary conference. And what I want you to note about is what she's there to pay attention to the literary conference. She's a budding and sort of recently successful writer. What she's distracted by, and these are the domesticity, right? She's distracted by all the kind of duties and responsibilities of domesticity. Marriage, radiators in church, getting difficulty in getting ice, her evening dresses, finding money, getting postcards for her children, right? So these kind of domestic aspects of domestic life are drawing her away from the focus on the kind of intellectual work of this literary conference that she had. So you actually will see that the kind of scattered, distracted mind is something throughout the literature that's associated both with women and with colonized peoples. So you'll see it in the literature of sort of, for example, writers like Roger Kipling, in which the sort of the minds of colonized peoples are described as, for example, as he says in I think the poem The White Man's Bird, half devil, half child, right? And so that half child part is associated with this kind of distractible nature. So this is something too that distraction has been sometimes used as a kind of a weapon to kind of criticize people who are viewed as sort of not as intelligent, not as capable of sort of sustaining thought as whoever is making that comment. Okay, and then lastly, just to bring it up to present day, so we have Sherry Chronicle here in 2010, just noted that distraction now takes on this other moral quality, which is it's distracting us from the kind of human interaction that we want to be able to have with one another. And that includes distraction from our children, for example, from our spouses, from our colleagues, in work obligations, right? So Turco kind of adds this element to it in which distraction from our devices is especially problematic because it takes us away from relationships with other human beings. Okay, so what we see through all these quotes are, quite a number of things. The problem is very persistent. It's something that seems to be fundamentally associated with the way we think and the way our minds work. It has a kind of moral quality to it oftentimes. And so we see that right up to the present day because our conversations are about students and their distractions. Often have a kind of moral quality to that, right? Why can't the students pay attention? What's wrong with the students these days? And that's a kind of legacy to some of these quotes that we've seen about distraction in relationship to women and colonized people. So all kinds of interesting stuff comes out when you start to look back at the way people have been talking about distraction. Now, what do the sort of neuroscientists and biologists tell us about this? So what do we learn about the sort of dance between attention and distraction from the people who study our minds? I'm going to draw primarily from a book called The Distracted Mind, which came out from MIT by Adam Ghazali, Larry Rosen, a neuroscientist and a psychologist. And they argue that actually the distraction represents a clash between two fundamental things in our minds. The first of those things is what we see here, and that is our ability to establish and pursue complex, time-lapse goals. So we can set a goal for ourselves that requires multiple steps to achieve, that can take place over long stretches of time. And this is what they argue here is one of the sort of pinnacles of the evolution of our brains. And so the fact that we are able to do this has enabled us to achieve everything. Like everything that the buildings and our intellectual work and everything that we think about as being associated with humanity is as a result of this kind of ability that we have been able to evolve. And so that's kind of the one side of this, okay? And that they argue our brains actually evolved in really sophisticated ways in terms of our ability to pursue goals. Now, a number of things support that. So one of those is our attention. Our ability to pay attention to something is extremely important in supporting our goal achievement abilities. And that actually includes two things. It includes our ability to focus as well as our ability to push away things that we don't want. These are actually two separate things. So one interesting thing that comes out of this research is that as we age, we are still able to maintain our focusing abilities, but we actually, our ability to push away distractions degrades. So sometimes you'll see, maybe some folks in this room may have experienced it themselves, that as we get older, for example, in a crowded restaurant, it becomes more challenging for us to focus on our conversation partner because of all those distractions. So that's an age-related thing. And of course, children have different kind of abilities to do both of these things as well. So over the lifespan, actually, these things evolve. Our working memory is what we normally think about as is where we do our thinking. So our working memory is something that can hold a few things in our heads at one time. Input from the environment as well as input from our memories. And it's where we do like what we think about as thinking. Is our working memory. But our working memory has limitations as well. It can only hold a very small number of things, and it requires us to be attentive to it in order for it to kind of do that goal-setting thinking. And the last thing is our goal management abilities. And they argue this is what they call the sort of traffic control, and it's sort of our executive function. And that's our ability to kind of like organize tasks, make sure that we're sort of pursuing and carrying them out. This too has limitations to it. And one of the ways that we see this is in task switching, otherwise known as multitasking, because we don't actually multitask, right? We switch back and forth very rapidly between tasks. But what happens when we do that is our ability degrades in terms of, as we go back and forth between them, our ability to achieve the goals that we've set sort of degrades in each of those areas. So these are things that are required for us to pursue our goals. Okay, and that goal setting ability is something that's, really a fundamental part of who we are. The problem is we have cognitive control limitations. And in each of those three areas I was looking at, they argue we haven't evolved this far. Essentially, our brains have not evolved this far. So like our goal setting abilities have evolved to here, our cognitive control abilities have evolved to like here. And so that means that we have kind of restrictions in these things that we need in order to be able to pursue our goals. We have a restricted ability to sustain attention, to like really focus on something for a long period of time. And then we have limitations there. To be able to hold detailed information in mind relates to our working memory. We can only hold a small number of things in our mind at one time. And again, the limitation here is in terms of task switching, to go back and forth from one thing to the other. So what they argue is that distraction is a conflict between our goal setting and pursuing activities and our cognitive control limitations. And this, if you think about it, right, distraction actually occurs when we are distracted from something we're trying or wish to do. Is it Friday? No, it's Monday. So on Saturday night, right, you get on Saturday night and you have nothing, you relax on Saturday nights, and you were on your phone looking at Facebook. You don't count yourself distracted then because you don't have anything else to do, right? Like that's just, you're doing that because it's fun. You want to see what your friends are up to, what they're doing that's more fun than whatever it is you're doing, right? so that's not distraction, right? Distraction is when we have something that we would wish to do, that we should be doing, and something is keeping us from that. So that's kind of an important thing as well, again, as we think about this in relationship or in the context of education. Okay, so what grabs our attention? So what sort of, again, thinking about sort of distraction and attention here, this is a fundamental distinction that you see in the research. There are two sort of things that grab our attention. Top-down is what we consciously choose to focus on. So the top-down attentional stuff is, I want to, you're trying to listen and pay attention here, some of you are writing things down, you're thinking about this in relationship to your own context or classes, right? So you're actively directing your attention right now. Now, if a loud noise were to happen right outside this room right now, everybody's heads would swivel a little bit, and your thought would be, what was that? But that's this. So we are actually subject to these bottom-up stimuli, which is our sort of reaction to what's going on in the environment. And lots of things influence that. Noises, lights, people saying your name. There's something called a cocktail party effect. If you're at a party and you hear your name, your mind sort of goes to it. Even if it's like, in some other context, you're much more likely to pay attention to that than, for example, if people are just randomly conversing about something else. So this is another way to think about this class, right? When students are in our classes, ideally they're sort of pursuing these top-down goals, right, in their executive sort of function. But this is possible to kind of draw them away from that. However, it's even more complicated than that, because the stimuli that distract us are not only external, we're subject to internal distractions as well, which is what we normally think about as mind wandering. Right? So we can actually be drawn away from something that we're trying to focus on by that bottom-up stuff, but we can be drawn away from it as well by our own sort of, why isn't somebody texting me back lately, or whatever. Any kind of thing that you might be thinking about, that can draw your attention away as well. Okay, so the argument here, so I've spent the first part telling you this is not a new problem, right? We've been worried about it for a long time. But in the second part, I want to note actually that it evolves, right? And things do change according to the technology. So I'm a kind of a middle ground person here, in the sense that I think that distraction itself is such a fundamental part of our cognitive sort of processing and the way our minds work that it's always been an issue for us. Apart from kind of what I was just showing you, the top-down and bottom-up thing. At the same time, as technologies evolve, they become better and better at sort of poking our stimuli, right? And so the technologies we have now are the best ones we've known in terms of their ability to kind of make us interested in what's in our pockets or what's on our devices. So technology didn't create this, as they argue here. This is from the distracted mind, but it aggravates and intensifies it. And so you could argue that different technologies throughout time have done that in different ways, but I think we are definitely seeing a pretty intense version of it right now. So this is just a nice little thing kind of support that idea. So this is some statistics about sort of people self-reporting their smartphone use in different contexts. So more than half of us report using our phones while driving. During a dinner date, about a third of us will pull out our phone and use it. While we're at our children's school functions, and I have 5 children, I have been so many school functions in my life. Believe me, I get that. They're usually terrible. So that, the phone is going to rescue you from boredom. Church, about 20% of people report using their smartphones in church. These last two are really good. It's really weird. Shower, 12% of us are using our smartphones in the shower. And the last one is the most bizarre. Sex. If you're using your smartphone during sex, I don't want to know about it. Right? What could that be for? I'm not really sure. But anyways, so this is part of kind of designed to show us here, right, how intensely the technologies are drawing us in. So this is not like, in some of the previous technologies where we had there was a separation, maybe a physical space separation between us and the technology, or it wasn't always accessible to us. When I was growing up, when I was very young, it was still the case that TV sort of went off at a certain time of the day, and then it was just like white noise, like snow for like however many hours that was until it started again in the morning. That those gaps have essentially closed, right? And so that's accessible to us at all times. Now the last slide I'll just show here in the biology part is an argument that Ghazali and Rosen make, which is that one of the reasons that these technologies are so effective for us is that as research done on primates suggests that as our brains have evolved into sort of primates and further, or into humans as well, we have taken to sort of our reward systems, our brain's reward systems, have taken to rewarding access to information in ways that sort of used to work only for being rewarded for things like food and sex. And so these, you see here, they argue that sort of primates are information-seeking creatures, right? And so when we seek information and receive it, our brains give us a little reward for that, because that was helpful to us in our evolution, right? If you found food, if you found a sexual partner, if you found a way to avoid a predator, right? These were things that you would get, our brains evolved to reward us for survival purposes. But that has now evolved and so you can, as they experiments with these monkeys, right, have shown that when they're given little bits of information, for example, when they're in some of these MRI machines, right, the same sort of circuitry that they get rewarded for food and drink happens when they're getting new bits of information as well. And what happens for us now with the phones, and the reason they're perhaps so intensely attractive to us, is they're constant little bursts of information. right? So when I'm seeking a little bit of information, or I'm seeking sort of a little stimulus, it's always available to me now, in a way that wasn't the case before. And so that's part of the issue that makes our phones so attractive to us. Okay, last part here, challenges and opportunities. So what does this mean for us? And I'm going to kind of just try and set the stage here for the next part. So the first thing to note is, of course, that our students are sort of deeply and thoroughly embedded in this, as we all are. This is from an EduCollege report that came out in 2016, actually, so this is even a couple of years old. The vast majority of our students, of course, have smartphones and laptops. Only 1% of college students in 2016 did not have a device of any kind, which is actually much, this is the American general population, 16% of the American population has no device. So, you know, our students, of course, are much more deeply embedded in these technologies than the general population. And they report that they are essential for their work. So that, you know, almost all students report that laptops are extraordinarily important for them to be able to do their work. And again, that's kind of just fundamentally noting that this is not something that we can, you know, sometimes people will argue for, you know, banning laptops and stuff like that. I think that's a challenging thing to do, in part because these things are so deeply embedded in students' lives now. And I observe student teachers at our school. We have an education program, so when we go into the classroom and observe our secondary school teachers, so they have to have a content expert observer. So I will observe the English teachers. And one of those teachers pointed out to me that the students coming up to K-12 education now, they are working with devices in class every day. Many of those students are going to be, you know, the schools have grants now where students are getting iPads or laptops. They're doing things. My mom's a kindergarten teacher, and her students have computer time, where they go to the monitors and do little sort of things. So to expect students to come here and then suddenly take that away is a challenging thing. And again, to me, is a challenging thing to think about. Consider how important they are and how embedded they have been in our students' lives at this point now from elementary school, from their elementary education. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are detrimental effects. And so again, of course, this comes from Ghazali and Rosen's distracted mind, and there's lots and lots of experiments that show results like this when students are in a class or listening to a lecture, when they're responding to text, and then afterwards they're tested on the material. And of course, they're learning, their mastery of the content degrades when these kinds of experiments are conducted. And that's been very consistent in any of these kinds of experiments in multiple educational contexts. It also somewhat degrades, I would argue, the sense of the classroom as a community and their connections to one another as the faculty member. So Ghazali and Rosen reported a really fascinating study, and this has been replicated by 3 different folks, in which people are asked to engage in conversations with one another, sometimes with no device anywhere near, sometimes with the device in their pocket, sometimes with the device on the table. And then when it's in their pocket or on the table, they don't touch it, nothing happens on the device, and yet still afterwards those conversations are reported as less satisfying, and they report less sort of empathy or connection with the person that they're conversing with, even when the phone is just sitting there on the table. And again, I'm sure most of us can sort of understand that, right? I'm talking to you, but I'm wondering, is there anything better on here? Right? Especially when I'm talking to a stranger, right? Or I'm just trying to make a connection for the first time. And it was even the case in these experiments when it wasn't their own phone. Just being reminded of a phone was enough to kind of degrade some of that sense of connection with the person that you were having the conversation with. So they report as less satisfying, generating less empathetic connection within the presence of the devices. So these are serious concerns, I think. So the things that we want to be able to kind of take into account and think about. Okay, so let's think about the opportunities here now as well. So in that same EduCollege report, around half students reported that they felt like they were able to get more actively involved in classes when they had the opportunity to use technology, perhaps in some of the ways that you're experiencing in the second half of this session. And this is important now because when we link this back to the sort of morality of distraction here. This actually was especially important, the ability to use technology for women and for students who are traditionally underrepresented in higher education. So, here we know that there are good studies which show that those students oftentimes feel less confident in speaking in class or in participating in class in traditional ways And apparently what's happening here is those students feel more comfortable engaging in the class through some of these ways that are technology enabled. So that's important too, right? Because this is something that we want, obviously. We want to make sure that as many voices as possible are being heard in the classroom, and that we have lots of ways for people to participate in the classroom. So if technology is giving us a tool to do that, that's important for us to take into account as well. There's no easy answers to this question. I hate to say it, I'm not going to come around to some like the easy solution. I don't think you are either. These are challenging things, but I think we have to keep both these things in balance, right? So there's this sort of potential degradation of learning and community on the one hand. On the other hand, though, we have the opportunity for people to have, maybe sort of express themselves and participate in conversations in ways in which they didn't have the opportunity to do in the past. Again, from that same EDUCAUSE 2016 report. What did technology help these students do? When they were asked, what is the technology enabling you to do? These were some of the things they said. So it enabled them to connect to both their faculty members as well as to their peers, as well as find ways to connecting to the different course content. So the technology, when they have access to it, is enabling them to do a number of things, again, trying to achieve some goals that are important to us. And so, again, we want to think about this. These are positive things that technology is enabling us to do, both inside and outside the classroom. So that we want to, again, put in the balance against what we know are the potential negative things here as well. Okay, so I'm going to finish with my last slide here, and I'm going to argue two things. The first thing I'm going to argue is in the title of the slide there, and that is that from the very beginning, tracing it back to Aristotle, we've been looking at this in these kinds of binary terms, right? Like there's attention, and then I'm either attentive or I'm distracted. And what the research is pretty clear about is that's a pretty simplistic way to look at this. And in fact, there's multiple ways to pay attention. Our attention systems are kind of multi-layered. That just kind of singular focusing that we think about as being attention is not the only way, that there are kind of under layers of attention that may be happening where we're kind of peripherally aware of things. That distraction actually is also not just distraction, right? And I would argue, to just give you an example of what I mean here, as I've been talking, I can guarantee that some of you occasionally have been thinking about like how something I said or what you saw on the slide connects to your own experience, right? And while you were doing that, you drifted away a little bit from what I was saying. But is that bad? Isn't that thinking, right? You were taking something that I had said, something that you had heard, and then we're kind of trying to create connections somewhere else, back to your own experience.
Yes, but if we were tweeting it, that.
All right. Maybe we'll get to that later. But if someone had paused you right now and say, "What are you thinking about?" You might have said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was distracted from there." But actually, what you were doing was thinking, right? And you were making creative connections with what you were hearing. So again, the line here is not very, it's not a bright line between attention and distraction. So that's the first thing. Is that I would like to see this conversation move beyond this binary of just sort of attention distraction and start to think in more complex ways about this. So in terms of what we can think positively, and so here I want to just think about like what are the uses or the powers of distraction. And if we think about it, if we kind of shift our thinking a little bit, we have a number of different things. Mindfulness is something that people normally think about as sort of training focus. If you don't know that much about mindfulness, that's all you might hear. I'm sort of training myself to be mindful and focused. Mindfulness is actually sort of cultivating your ability to just pay attention to what's happening in your own mind, right? And when you do that, you see all the stuff that's going on, and there's benefits to that, which I think are very well demonstrated in lots of research. But it's not about just sort of training yourself to stay focused on something. Mindfulness, I think, can help make people more aware of their internal processes and their cognitive processes. John Kabat-Zinn, one of the sort of founders of mindfulness, argues that one of the ways to think about this is to sort of sit back on the bank of the thought river and watch what happens, right? And sort of becoming more aware of what's going on in your mind is one of the things that can help us. Can help us kind of move forward and think in different ways about this process. Connection, I would argue here, is, again, what we might think about distraction, what is often happening if we're kind of still in the general area, if you've been thinking about something else in your own experience, but it's connected to what we've been talking about here, that's something that we want. That's what it means to internalize learning, right? To take what you're hearing or reading or experiencing and think about it in relationship to your own life, your own context, or a problem that you're trying to solve in some other way. And then, in fact, that's often what we consider our best thinking, when we take unlike things and kind of put them together in new ways. Right? And that happens, part of what that looks like, it resembles distraction. Right? Like I'm here, but I'm now going to take what I'm saying about attention and apply it to a problem that you're thinking about in relationship to your own discipline. That's going to produce something new and interesting. It looks like distraction, but actually it might, it kind of shows the positive potential side of this. And that's similar here for the last part of this. That process can become creative, right? So if I, am studying a problem, to give an example, Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, used to say, what his process was to start a poem and then go walking. And then as he was walking, he would see and be distracted by lots of things, but those things would sort of inform the poem that he was writing, and then he would come back to his desk, and that's when the poem would sort of really come to life. And you read the sort of stories of lots of artists and creative people, that's oftentimes what they describe as well. That this sort of deliberate attempt to distract yourself while you're working on something is actually a really powerful method to spur creativity. So again, we can think about this as there's a potential power here of distraction, or what we in the past might have just called distraction, that can help us kind of maybe get beyond this sort of simple way of thinking, just am I attentive or am I distracted? Okay, so that's to sort of finish my part, but I want to just see, before we take a break, let's see what questions come in. And you can call stop when so, have questions? Nice. Nothing, I convinced you completely. See, that you're just distracted, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wonder where would you fit in here, not quite distraction, but sort of the intentional attending to other things in the class. So I saw on readmyprofessor.com that my class has been a great place for students to sometimes do other homework.
So again, what you're experiencing there is goal clashing, right? Like that student has the goal of sitting in your class and paying attention and wanting to do well, but they've also got a goal of sort of that other class. I'm not sure, that again, we typically think about distraction as being, I'm being drawn away, right, by my phone or by my wandering mind or something like that. To me, that I'm not sure that's actually distraction. I have two different goals, and I'm making a choice to sort of, cut loose one and pursue the other. I'm doing it at the wrong time, like from your perspective. But I'm not sure I would even classify that as distraction, because if they're actually working on their homework, they're attentive to that thing, right? Because they're not attentive to the thing that you would like them to be attentive to in that moment.
So I was telling my table mates here that in a class I taught last quarter, I had one student who had been homeschooled, and her learning style was completely different than everyone else's. It seems to me, and it was backed up by a conversation we had, that she learned at the kitchen table with the computer. So as she was being taught, she was actively encouraged to go look for links to that subject. And 80% of the time, I couldn't. So I was faced with the challenge that what was essential to her learning was distracting to other people, even when it was productive for the discussion in the class. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge of sort of, well, there's two things there. Sort of different students are going to sort of have different, just like people are sort of predisposed to different kinds of addictions, for example, right? And people are more like, and so again, individual differences. The research suggests that people are predisposed differently to distraction as well. So that like some people are more likely to be distracted by both external or internal stimuli. Some people, we all kind of think different. So there's the one issue there. The other issue is one student being on a device in a distracted manner can distract other students as well. And so the example I like to give is I was on a plane a few months ago, and I was sitting in the aisle seat, and I had every intention to do my work, which I was doing, but the guy across the seat in front of me was watching a movie. And it was a movie that I had wanted to see. And even though I couldn't hear anything, there was a screen about this big, I just could not help myself. Like I just would, I felt like half the work done I wanted to because I kept looking over. And the same will be true in class as well. So to me, this is about, I didn't really touch, I have some arguments on what I think the implications are for pedagogy here, which I didn't show here, but one of the things for me about this is that this is an opportunity for discussion and to try and provide students an opportunity to have a voice in policies that cover this kind of thing. And so to invite students to say, we all recognize there are some potential problems with their technology use. Some of you it's going to be helpful. Let's try and identify the ways in which this class can have the best kind of operating procedures. Kathy Davidson is someone who's done a lot of work on the idea of a class constitution, right? So that the class has a constitution in which we agree together what are our kind of policies going to be in some of these areas. And technology can be used to kind of gather that information, right? So, if you want to be able to use a laptop, you need to sit around the outside edges of the room. So, for example, to know if you're going to, no one will be able to see you. Or there are certain times in the class when everyone can have their laptops out, and we want to be able to use it. These other moments, I'd like us to focus in sitting in a circle and just sort of hang, right? So, like, thinking about, I think that the students have been hearing about distraction from their whole life at this point, right? Like, I know, again, from my wife, being a kindergarten teacher and being in secondary ed classrooms, their teachers are talking about this. They've been hearing about it. They know it's a problem potentially for them as well. And so to me, rather than just saying, don't do this or do this, the better thing to do with 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds is to say, let's help each other. How can we do this together in a way that can be most helpful to us? So that's my take on it.
So two ideas. So when I work with instructors, I often hear kind of two different things. So one is that they take it as a learning goal of the class almost to help students to pay better attention. Yeah. Right? That is one of the things that they are aiming for. And so I'd like to hear what you might have to say about that, just for my own personal. But then second, at this particular institution, so in the humanities and social sciences core, those classes are capped at 19. And one of the things that you hear, which is connected to your point about community, potential costs for community, is that part of the enterprise, part of the goal, is for 18, 19 students to sit around a table with nothing but the text and their fellow learners and pour over the text in a variety of different ways. I've even heard faculty talk about they don't want them to take notes even by hand, right? That's the point of the exercise. So I was just wondering if you could comment on.
Yeah. So drawing in just another piece I didn't include here. So you might have heard of the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which his name looks very different than the way I said it. He developed the concept of flow, right? You've heard of the concept of flow. And so flow is, this concept was developed by Csikszentmihalyi, and has been done a lot of research subsequently afterwards. In the flow state that we can get into when we are attentive to something, it's like what you think, whatever your favorite thing to do is, like if you have a hobby or a sport or reading or writing or whatever it is. When you're in that sort of zone, sometimes we call like in the zone as well. That is what Csikszentmihalyi called the flow state. The flow state is one of the things that is when we are really attentive. We're doing something that we're good at, but we're being pushed a little bit beyond. So we're kind of acquiring new skills. It's a very positive, and it's also a happiness-inducing state. And the research showed that the more we engage in flow activities, the more time we spend in them, our sort of happiness quotient goes up. So that to me tells us actually, again, sort of to make this more complex, that in fact we do want to try and find ways to help and encourage people to be in those kinds of flow states, right? Where like they are kind of attentive to something, they can cultivate that capacity and that skill. So for that reason, I'm sympathetic with the sort of desire of faculty members to say sometimes we don't have our stuff out. Sometimes it's just brain and a book, right? I wrote a Chronicle called A Brain and a Book. So I'm very sympathetic to this idea. So for me, again, it's about thinking strategically about what is the purpose of a class period. and that sometimes there are times for telling, when, for example, I've just been telling you stuff. Sometimes there are times for engagement that might include technology, and sometimes there are times that don't, that are about building community and are about kind of cultivating these moments of attention. To my mind, probably a class should include all of those things at different times, right? And so we should be strategic about thinking about why are we doing this now? What is going to be best for the learning of the students? And so that's the first thing, strategically. So that my three kind of things are autonomy, pedagogy, and transparency. So I've already talked about autonomy, and that was the response I gave to you, inviting students in this conversation. Pedagogy is what I've just been saying, is to think strategically about, there might be times here when it's best for everyone to have their devices away and just a book or whatever, and then we look at each other and we talk to each other. And then there might be times when we are doing things, like we're going to do a poll, and then we're going to use our devices to look things up. So that's thinking pedagogy. And then the transparency part is, let's just be clear about what we're doing and why. And so when I want to have the bring in the book thing, I'm going to say, look, part of what's important and I'm trying to cultivate in you is this ability to kind of look another human being in the eyes and understand and listen. Because that's the most important thing probably in discussion, is my ability to show respect for the speaker by listening to them and truly kind of taking in what they're saying before I respond. And the technology is going to get in my way of doing that. And that little speech is a speech that the students should hear. Right? So that's, to me, those are the kind of three avenues that I've been trying to pursue: autonomy, transparency, and pedagogy.
I want to make my point. I want to talk about Aristotle, these flow states of mindfulness real quick.
Wow, you're doing a lot together. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, I like it though. You're connecting, right?
Yeah, they're all related because I've been thinking a lot about this. All right, where to begin? So, as you alluded to, there's this growing body of research that's showing certain contemplative practices can do things like increase people's cognitive control, increase people's emotional regulation. There's good evidence that people trained in meditation are better at task switching. And so my general question is, in your opinion, ought there to be a time set aside in every class to actually have students engage with these practices, to increase their intention, like deliberately set time aside to do this in a vacuum? Because I mean, you talked about Aristotle, and he has this pretty unuseful binary between kind of a distraction. Then you reference these flow states, but interestingly, both of these things have been described for the past 3,000 years. The Buddhists and the Hindus have talking about these altered states of consciousness that you can access that have radical implications for your mind control and the level of well-being you can access on a daily basis. So I'm just wondering, in your opinion, what role did these mindfulness practices from theoretically and practically?
Yeah, so we just conducted a major experiment. We had a big grant from an institution to pursue exactly this question. So, because I think what the question is, we do need to we need to measure, does it make a difference, right? So if we had students engaging in a mindfulness activity every day, we want to be able to see, does it do anything or not, right? Because I'm very convinced, I'm a mindfulness practitioner, and I have been for the past, I don't know, since I turned 40, so 8 years. So I'm totally convinced it's beneficial, but I'm less convinced that it's something that can just be done quickly in a class, for example, in the kind of, so this is what we did, we tested. And I have to tell you, that's what it showed essentially. That now we only did it, we tested it, students did a mindfulness activity at the beginning of class. They only did it one time, and then we tested them afterwards on the material from that day. But we had a bunch of other conditions where they were a day where they didn't do mindfulness, a day where they did something called cognitive reappraisal. The cognitive reappraisal is essentially, they got a little script they heard on iPad, on headphones on an iPad, which said, you might feel bored in class. This is completely normal. Most students will experience boredom in class at some point. If you feel boredom, here's something that you might do to kind of get yourself back on track. So there was a mindfulness condition, a cognitive reappraisal condition, a control condition, in which they just heard some subject matter stuff, and they went through an iPad and clicked some stuff about the subject. And then there was days when they did nothing. So we tested at the end of these days, but then we also did a thing at the end of the semester. And to test on all the days to see whether it had made a long difference. The only thing that made a difference was the cognitive reappraisal. And so it turned out that giving them some strategies to think about how to, and some people, one of our team members, the team who participated, one of the team members argues that our cognitive reappraisal looked a lot like mindfulness. Essentially was telling them, you're going to experience this in your mind, this is how to manage it if this happens, And so that it's not, again, maybe a really clear line. But the mindfulness thing, we did have a mindfulness expert who kind of did a mindfulness breathing focus thing for a few minutes with that. Again, it was on an iPad or iPhones. So my feeling on this, as far as I know, the jury's kind of still out on this. Like and I would like to see, we need more research in which students are being asked, for example, to do a 5-minute mindfulness being in every class versus, a class in which that's not, a whole other set of classes. So I'm hopeful. I would like to see that make a difference, but I want to see what happens. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Please join me in thanking James. So we're going to take a 5-minute break or so. There's coffee and other refreshments at the back, and then we'll get started with Joella Jacobs.
Can we check our notifications?
All right, everyone, let's get started. I'm not going to use the microphone, but you can all hear me, right? Okay, great. My name is Catherine Merchan. I am a fellow with the CCT. I'm also a PhD candidate in religion, literature, and visual culture here in the Divinity School. Thank you all for being here. I also just want to reiterate and thank Pam and Caroline and Aaron with the Craft of Teaching for their hard work organizing this event. And just a couple reminders. If you haven't signed in those computers over there, please do so. Even if you are not a student or faculty member, you can just enter in 8 random digits, and that's fine because it's important for our numbers. And then also after this, there's going to be coffee and dessert and a nice reception where we can all talk to one another. So, okay, so let me introduce our next speaker. Joella Jacobs is, I almost mispronounced your name. Joella Jacobs is Assistant Professor of German Studies at the University of Arizona, where she teaches a wide range of undergraduate and graduate courses in German literature, language, and culture. Her interdisciplinary research in environmental humanities and Jewish studies has translated into the development of several large general education courses, such as From Animation to Zombies, the ethics, biopolitics, and aesthetics of defining life, that engages 250 first-year students with an in-class response system and a collaborative learning space every spring. As a UChicago alumna with a PhD in Germanic Studies from 2014 and a former CCC teaching consultant, transitioning into this different educational environment requires her to scale teaching strategies up and down with class size and technology use. And Dr. Jacobs is advancing these active learning techniques now as part of Arizona's new faculty learning community. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacobs. All right, I'll try this out. Let's see if it turns on for me. Just to show that we're not tech phobic, right? Let's see. And as you know, working with technology, it'll always take a second. I'll let you try and do it. All right. So it was really great to hear this first part. I think we've been set up with a lot of useful information, and a lot of the questions went in the direction of, so what do we do then in the classroom, right? How do we approach this? And that's what we're going to talk about and do now. But before we get started in that, so here's a little overview of what we're going to do today. I want to do introductions because building community, as you said, is an important part of class, and I think that's something that's incredibly important to me as well. So for a second, imagine your dream teaching position. And you might have your dream teaching position already, but you might be striving for it, or you might want to improve the one that you have, or whatever it is. And if you're a graduate student, as I think most people in the room are, that's something you're maybe thinking about. So is it a liberal arts college? Is it a large state school? Is it a community college? Is it an R1? Is it a high school? What's your dream teaching position? So for a second, think about that and think about what would be your biggest adjustment if you were teaching in that position. Time to think. introduce yourselves, share a little bit. What do you think would be the biggest adjustment going from here to another place? You'll get to talk to each other again, I promise. So you'll have an opportunity to check in about more of these things, and that's also what this lovely coffee reception afterwards is for, to talk more about these things. So I hope you've all met someone, and can I just hear a couple shout-outs for challenges we're talking about?
Last size.
Last size, yeah. Any others? See people nodding?
Buy-in from students outside the field of the class.
Buy-in, yeah, definitely a challenge that I'm experiencing in German studies. We're not a big program. Ken, what did you have?
Grading.
Grading, yeah, definitely. It's the last of the semester for us, so I'm in the middle of that, and as Catherine said, there are large numbers involved, so really the pain and technology is helping with that to some degree.
The hybrid classroom.
Hybrid classroom, absolutely, yeah, that's one of the, definitely one of the main points here. Okay, I'll tell you about, to introduce myself, I'll tell you about some of the challenges or biggest adjustments that I had that are sort of more general. So the first one is technology use. If you've been at UChicago, you know there are chalkboards in most rooms still, and there's some whiteboards somewhere. And you see that in this room. We had to actually try to tape those windows shut so there wasn't any glare on this one monitor. And in my classes, usually I walk around, and this is kind of a tripping hazard here because it's pretty tight, right? So this room isn't really set up for that. And at Arizona, people were doing everything with PowerPoint, doing everything with technology. And when I arrived there, I was like, oh, good thing you don't know that my job talk was the first time that I actually used the PowerPoint. So that was one of the things that was a big adjustment coming from here. And so what you see now, if you're thinking, oh, this is savvy with technology, it's actually fairly easy to learn. So I would encourage you, don't be afraid of the technology. Don't be afraid of the mic. All of these things you can conquer. The next thing was my own expectations, and that's certainly something you'll experience anywhere you go. Especially from students, I had to sort of cut the readings in half and then see how that would go, and cut them in half again maybe, and sort of see what are the kinds of things they don't know or do know. And one thing I found lovely, I don't know if that's something you experience too, but at Chicago, students don't tend to ask questions. they tend to pretend they know it already. At the place I'm now at Arizona, people ask questions, and I found that refreshing. It was actually incredibly helpful for me to see, whoa, I just used a big word, something jargony, I should explain that. That is my job. And they made me realize that student expectations of me were also different. And partly that has to do with technology. Partly they were expecting other things there. And I mean, there's a variety of things. I can't go into each of these in as much detail as I would love to over like a beer or something. There's so many anecdotes there, but you can ask me about them later too. Student preparation is a big one. Some students have been really failed by their high schools. That's something that we're experiencing an incredible range. So if we're talking about diversity, that is one component we definitely have to take into account. There is just such a range of preparation and just on teaching. That's the next thing. Freshmen that are really socializing them into this environment, socializing them into the university expectation. We might think that those are clear because we might have experienced those all along. We might know, oh, taking notes is a good idea, right? Or we might know, for instance, I should have my headphones in while I'm sitting in lecture. Not all my students know that, and this is nothing to say about them. It's just someone needs to tell them, right? And so the headphones thing is actually a really nice anecdote for distraction because the first time I saw this, I walk up to a student and I'm like, hey, I'm talking, take the headphones out. And the student says to me, it's music, I can focus better. What do you do, right? I was really stumped when that happened. Now I have a policy in my syllabus that says, while we're talking to each other, there shouldn't be any headphones. So whether that's me, whether that's people in their group works or something like that. But during exams, during the times when you need to drown out the other noise, absolutely bring your headphones, prepare yourself to a creative, focused environment for yourself. But that's something, we have this conception. Headphones in, this person doesn't want to listen to me. This person doesn't care, right? Because we think it's incredible. I thought it was incredible. And so that was something I had to explain. Hey, when you do this, what I see is that you don't want to engage. And I think that was important to make clear and be transparent about. And then class sizes. You heard that. That was a big adjustment. I think what was it? Like a German major seminar here at UChicago will have 6 students. That's sort of the size we're going with. That's what I was working with here. And then my first class at Arizona had 60, and I was like, oh my God, what are we doing? And now I have had semesters where I had 450 students. So this happens. And I'll be talking about class size because I want to say one thing. Technology, if I had 5 of you, I wouldn't need the technology, right? We could do this without it. But if I have 50 of you, then technology will definitely help us engage and help me engage with you in more varied ways. And so I'm not saying technology always, no matter what. It's really a matter of what do we need, how can we scale up the activities we would otherwise do, at that wonderful round table that Jody had brought out where we have 19 students sitting around a table and we need nothing else. That's beautiful, that's ideal, but I can imagine that a lot of people will go out there and will end up at places where that's not the case because, of course, the big courses are money makers, and that's why people get thrown into teaching them. So the question is then, what do we do, right? Okay, so much for introductions. So we've heard in this first part that distraction is kind of unavoidable. It's always been around. It occurs more on the spectrum than really those 2 poles. It can be productive and creative. So my argument is all for why don't we use it in teaching? Why? Because often we're battling it. I think it can become even obsessive that we're sort of going after people. We're like, is she taking notes or is she taking something? And typing to a friend. We get really sort of into policing, and that's a sort of a mindset that I'm trying to get out of. Because I realize when I get into policing, I stop seeing the things that matter. I sort of stop seeing how people engage, and I sort of put a cookie cutter mold onto this of how students should be engaging. And I think that's something we've clearly heard today is not helping us. So the goal then would be to create a learning environment that enables students to engage in various ways. That allows them to engage actively with material, that sort of maybe gives them focused ways of switching tasks, right? Because that will sustain their attention if they get to switch to a new kind of task, a new kind of engagement. And so that accounts for distraction, but it's also, I would say, more accessible and inclusive. And I think we've seen that already. I think in that, I'm hoping that I'm preaching to the choir. I do want to say one note about accessibility. Technology really is a means for accessibility. If we're talking about students who have accommodations, and even students who don't know that they need accommodations, I think it's a really big thing to remember that when we tell everyone laptops away, we're closing some doors for some people who need that kind of support, right? And that's something to keep in mind. All right, so if that's our goal, we can also have a secondary goal, and something that came up in the mindfulness conversation, that focus can be practice. That when we socialize people into a university environment, that means we can also socialize them into more sustained focus, right? And that is something that we can do in incremental ways, that we can practice it well, that can be a goal. So, like Joe suggested earlier. All right, so if this is what we want to do, assuming, I don't want to speak for you, but if that's something that you're interested in, how do we do it? And I'd invite you to brainstorm 3 ideas at your table, the people at your table, and then I'll give you 3 ideas. All right, take some time for that. There's more opportunities to talk, I promise, again. So, ideas. Does anyone want to share a couple?
I do math, and there's a lot of interaction between visual things and sort of equations, and there are cool tools that you can use online that allow you to sort of move a slider to change certain aspects of the equation, and then you get an immediate visual change. And it's a nice way to sort of like make math physical, and also you can sort of like fidget and play with these things, but as you're playing with them, you're learning.
Great, excellent. Other ideas?
I've been working with a professor over in high school who has students before they leave class send in, I guess via Canvas, a 2-sentence summary of the main points what they learned in class that way, and then he collates them and sends them out to everyone with the names on them. So like maybe you might not have gotten the point in class, and it will be very clear when you look at that. I think his idea is just that people have a chance to reflect on what they've learned.
Yeah, and there's accountability in it too, right? And it's getting a sense of where you stand in class, because technology can help us out in a lot of ways. Often when we're sort of anonymous, we don't know how we measure up, and students are really curious about that, right? They want to know that. What else? Other ideas? This is really great.
So I have my students sometimes work in groups and come up with exam questions, and then I tell them if I use the question, they'll get some extra points or something like that. So they're working collaboratively towards a goal.
Great. I really love that because first of all, you get them to work together. They have to agree on something there, and then they get a real tangible results out of that, which can be really, really rewarding. And some of you might say, whoa, but then they know the exam question. But I do think there's more at play here. I think that kind of flexibility to think through how are we assessing them also is really important. Plus, writing questions is hard. Writing good questions is so hard. So if the students can help us with that, all the better. They're the best proofreaders for that kind of stuff. The best improvers too. Maybe one more idea? Someone is volunteering someone.
I would say one of our members in the table said that moving is important. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I was on the right track, but the distraction, if students are distracted, then change it. Change it up, do something else, and move.
Absolutely.
I always like, now because I teach language, talk to someone else, do something else, move around.
Exactly. So what I would
settle down.
Right. What I would say is the homework question, right? That would be one of those things. All right, you gotta find a way to shake them out of it so that they can't possibly do their homework. And I'm saying this with a full disclosure that yes, I've seen students do homework in my office too. So we're all in the same boat. But I think one way to do this also in a way that doesn't single out one person is move them around, shake it up, do something different where they cannot sustain that focus on their homework.
And also, if they're moving, they can't take all this stuff with them.
Yeah.
Your hands are empty.
So you know what I'm going to do to you. Yeah. All right. Okay. So these are great ideas. I think we're all on the right track. And I want to give you a couple of tips and tools. And you might have heard about some of them. I heard some of those words and what you were saying. And if you haven't, all of this can be looked at. That's why I said earlier on the overview slide, this is evidence-based stuff. If you Google any of them, you'll find research articles about this. But I'm going to relate it to my experiences at Arizona, and of course, questions are welcome there at any point. So I have three things for you, like I promised. So this will be a portion where you listen for a little bit, and then we'll put it into practice. And you will recognize that that's one thing I recommend on here as well. So the first one is, and that's something that you just said beautifully, active learning. Make the students do something. I think in language classrooms we do this a lot already because they're practicing, right? But in other classrooms we can see the same thing. Apply a concept, solve a problem. We all have that, right? Even if it's let's say it's a close reading exercise, it's solving a math problem together. All of these things, have them do something actively, because just listening is not going to do it, right? We know that from ourselves. We can't just take it all in. We need to apply it to figure it out. And in this active learning, the goal really is to engage students, but also then to enable them to be independent with this. If they solved it once in class, right, they can solve it again at home. if they learn how to correct, let's say, their accusative case or something like that, right, they can go forward and do that again and again. And what they also bring to it is their own take to the material, right? We might have one way to identify the accusative, they might find another. So what we get really here is another measure to be inclusive, to really account for all sorts of ways of engaging with the material. And one great way to do this, and I'll say that later on the slide, but I'll tell you already, and we're doing this right now as a learning cycle, right? So first is an exploration. You explore new materials with minimal guidance to raise questions and complexities. That's what we did with the 3 ideas that you were trying to think about. You were trying to think about this kind of context. Then the introduction. This is happening right now. I'm giving you new concepts, terms, a thinking pattern related to what we talked about. And then the application, and that's what we'll do after. You'll do this in practice, so applying new concepts to materials with a variety of examples. I'll be giving you 2 ways of engaging, so that you can practice it, and that you can see it maybe one time from that side and the other time from another side. So that tends to work well for me. One thing that requires, of course, is that I get my timing right, and that I scaffold this, that I build this onto each other, that all of these things work together for the intended goal that I have. All right, so that's the first idea, active learning. Now, I didn't do just active learning. I had you talk to each other. And I'll wait until the picture of the slide is taken, because that is also a way of engaging, right? It's technology. I want to point that out. It's a good one. And my students do that a lot. They take pictures of slides even though they have access to the slides. It shows me, okay, this part is somehow doing something. This part is ticking, right? So here's the next one, doing active learning together, doing it collaboratively. That's one of the words that came up already. So doing something interactively, because that promotes even more diversity of all kinds, right? Of approaches, of thinking, of background. People hear something new, and it also really promotes soft skills and socialization. And I think students need that. If we're looking at one of your points, right, building community, I think we need to make time for that. It's also something that employers say, and you'll hear that line if you're at a state institution all the time. Employers want this. Google just had another article saying we need the humanities because of the soft skills. And that, is of course sort of a double-edged sword to hear, but nonetheless, you'll hear it all the time. And I do think that these are important skills, right? We want them to have an opportunity to practice those. Now, there are a couple of considerations if you do collaborative work like that. My large classrooms are built for this. They're being renovated. Collaborative learning spaces is the key word. You see that at other institutions, Michigan as well. They have round tables of 6, movable tables and chairs that are really light. They have screens either at every wall, or if the room is larger and has sort of pillars in between for structural safety, they'll have smaller screens at all the pillars. That obviously costs money. Make the scientists pay for it. They want it now. They want collaborative and active learning. They want problem solving for their large lecture courses, and they do it. And they have tons of TAs, and they have all the funding for it. So let them do some of that, and then sneaky leavers are the group. That's sort of what's happening for me. So you see that the room is one consideration. But I also teach these lecture courses in tiered lecture halls, and I just, have the students turn around. Have the groups be smaller, be a little bit more flexible with how I do it, and it still works. What I do in those rooms is I do away with the front. This one is very front-heavy because you're all looking in the same direction, so that's why nobody is sitting sort of facing in the other direction, or barely anyone, right? Because it becomes uncomfortable. So if you had a screen in the back, that would all go away, and I wouldn't be so much this frontal lecturing person anymore, automatically, and I would be walking around engaging more with you. That's one thing that happens in these rooms. So a lot of the smaller classrooms, you can actually do that by just moving the tables and chairs. If you take 5 minutes to be there early, to have the students help you and talk to them about why you do this, right? Then it can definitely work. The next one is think about how you create your groups. initially I always let students just do whatever they wanted. And then I had like one table that was all one sorority, and then I had one table that was doing all the work in Chinese. And then so I wanted to mix it up. It happens. And they were translating back into English, and I was just admiring them for doing twice the work in the same time. But I wanted them to have more experience, more diversity of knowledge, experience, identity, and so forth. So be mindful of your groups. And one thing I do with my 250 is that I still randomize it, but I have sort of, they get a color, a letter, a vowel, a color, a vowel, and a number. And so I have dice, I can roll the dice, and I can organize them by number, I can organize them by color. It feels a little bit like elementary school, but for organizing it's great, and there are lots of technology tools that can help you with group setup as well. Lots of ideas out there to Google to figure out what you want. Mine is sort of, I don't want to be too imposing. I don't want to really like look up every name and match them together. It's also possible in those sizes. But if you can do it, of course, and you can put some thought into that, that's really great. The last one is make the group process fair. Everybody hates group work because the work is uneven. If you can take that out, students are much more likely to engage with that. So I have roles. I say, okay, today the blue person in your group is the note taker, and the red person is the presenter, right? So if I have them some sort of identifiers assigned, but even if you don't, you can say, all right, the person who's the oldest in your group is going to be the note taker today. The person whose birthday is in the summer is going to be the presenter, and something like that, right? It's going to shake out. All right. So far so good. I have one more idea. Yeah? All right. It's technology. We've been building up to this. How can we use technology? And this is sort of the fullest slide. Because I wanted to sort of give a little bit of a sense of what technology can do aside from engaging. I think it can engage. So we're using the devices that we sort of say are so terrible purposefully for something else, right? And it can engage students, but there's also an element of assessing. Where are they? With you in the room, if I pulled you at the beginning to see sort of, are you a graduate student or faculty or something else, what's your field? And if I then show that to all of you, we get a really good sense of behaviors, right? You get that sense through talking at your tables, but that's one thing you can do in a large class. I can show them, hey, you are all predominantly freshmen, right? You're in the same boat with that. The next thing is, so aside from getting that information and making it visible, is to hold students accountable. Often group work doesn't work that well because we have no measure of follow-up. We'll say, and now we go around the room and every group presents what they have said, and then nobody else is listening, and sometimes that's that phase, and everybody behaves, and yeah. With some of the technology that I'll be talking about, students will be typing in their responses. So the note taker will be typing in the group conversation, and I see it going over the screen, but I don't read it in class necessarily. I'll be at that time engaging with groups, walking around while they're doing their group work, but I have a record on it. And I can look at it later, and I can follow up with groups and say, hey, it doesn't seem to be really working in your group. What's going on? Or I might see something flickering over the screen. I was like, that's a really great point. But also, I can just call in the groups now. They have all done the work. They have it in writing. Now I should be able to get an answer from anyone, right? So that's sometimes when I roll my dice in class, to make sure there is accountability, and I get one student to roll in the dice, and all right, you're it. Tell me, question one, what did you discuss? But in these phases of sort of talking in groups, it's much more important that they talk. The record is one thing, but if they engage with each other, that's really the main goal. All right, it holds me accountable. If you write something on your PowerPoint slide, you have to be ready to talk about it, right? You have to manage your time. You have to scaffold it, build on each other, and you're focusing on pedagogy, I think, over content. If you are in a technology system that prompts you to think about, when will I ask this question? What will be my follow-up, right? To me, it has really done that. And I create automatic review material, too, because if this is a platform that students have access to, that's what happens. And I see sort of some of you faces going, yeah, but I can't quite picture it. And I'll show you, we'll picture it in a second. So last one, it helps with class management, so group such classes, we have that, and accessibility. We talked about that too. So what does this look like? That's probably the biggest question. I brought you one way to practice it today, but I'm in class, I'm actually using another. The reason why I'm not doing this with you is that that's a paid access platform, and then you would have to do logins and all that stuff right now. We don't have time for that. But if you're interested in exploring technologies, a lot of schools have the traditional clicker, so it's a handheld device. But that kind of development has gone farther. There are lots of, they're called in-class response systems. So you have your laptop out, like you do right now, and I would be posing a question, and you would just answer it on your screen, and you would be typing in your screen. That's sort of how the experience is. And on the big screen, we would see the answers rolling through, where I would show you the responses, I would show you the outcome, show you the right answer, show you how people feel about a certain issue. Right? That's what you can do. I do that with TopHat. The students each buy a subscription. It's, I think, now $27 per semester. They don't buy a book in my course, so that's the one thing they buy. And with that, we use that in every class. The slides are in it, the questions are in it, discussion tasks are in it. The one I'll be showing you today is Kahoot. And a lot of people also like Socrative. And with Kahoot, it's sort of a polling software. I can ask you lots of different kinds of questions. I can do quizzes. And because I see on your faces that it's time to get you engaged, that's what we will do. So, get out your devices, your phone, your laptop, it doesn't matter. You just need a browser and you go to kahoot.it. And if you don't have one, let your new friends to your left and right peek over your shoulder. Kahoot.it. And so I'm switching out of this too. And if it lets me, all right, let's just close it now and open it back up. And here is my tab. All right, so we're going to be playing a little quiz to see if you paid attention. And are you all on Kahoot.it? All right, okay. So this asks you if you're ready to join, and in a second there will be a join code up here, and you'll be prompted to put in this number on your screen. 50, 61, 77. 50, 61, 77.
Is that game pin?
That's the game pin, yeah, that's where you put it. And you can put in your name and see we have some people joining our quiz. Cool, we have a lot of players. Yeah, and well, if you have freshmen, you got to be careful because they will use offensive names sometimes. So you can police in these kinds of systems, and you can also tell them, look, I can connect that name to your real name. This is not the internet, which is sometimes something people need to understand. So this is not Reddit or YouTube or something like that. All right, do we have what we want? Everyone feeling good? 3, 2, 1. All right. There will be 4 questions. You'll see the question on the screen and the response possibility, but you press the buttons on your own device. If you just pick one of those colors, which of these is an element of active learning? Is it red? Is it blue? Is it yellow? Is it green?
Do you mind reading out the...
Engaging students is red. Promoting inclusivity is blue. Practicing problem solving is yellow. And applying concepts is green. But what you see is which ones you paid most attention to, right? You saw in the distribution which ones were picked them out. So this one had all correct ones. Next question, which of these is a phase of the learning cycle? Red, introduction. Blue, exploration. Yellow, application. Green, distraction. Right? But will you get points?
Oh, I totally got this one wrong.
So it's a realistic scenario then. People can get things wrong. And you see a lot, most people are interested in exploration too. So we see also where people's minds go. And here is your scoreboard. Michael, you're doing well. And Joe too. All right, next one. What is the benefit of collaborative learning? Is it red, promoting diversity, blue, making friends, yellow, finding multiple solutions or paths to a solution, green, practicing soft skills? All right, nobody wants to make friends. All of them are correct though, and there is one last one. Get ready for it. What can technology do for you? Red one, engage students. Blue, hold me accountable. Yellow, assess my students. Green, hold students accountable. Or give you cat pictures. All right, engaged students is the biggest one. Great, so let's see how you scored. Joe, you're second place. Michael, who's Michael? Michael. All right, let's give a hand to Michael. So why did he score? Because he was fast, right? In this one, he was fast and correct. If I had more wrong answers, obviously that was playing more into the equation of this. But part of this was just being fast now. All right, you can see how that can work, right? Whoa, we don't want to play it again. No, no, no. All right.
Wait, I have the answer now.
Okay, so let's go back to the slideshow. Actually, we need to be a couple more in, but this is a good reminder of what we did. The next step is put your devices away. Because part of teaching with technology means also having really dedicated moments of closing the laptop. And I do that a lot when we have phases where students don't have to respond to something on their screen because this is sort of their experience. I ask them to at least close it up. And sometimes it requires that I walk by them and, look at them to really close it up. But sometimes what also works is to say, last device open, we'll answer the next question. Those devices are gone. Last cell phone I see, that person will answer the next question. Okay. So there are these moments when I'm saying, all right, now we're in talking mode. Now we're in conversation. You don't need your device, right? And that's what we'll do now. This is the second way to apply this, which is raise your hands, and this is sort of the last thing we'll do today. This is a finishing slide. You don't run away from me quite yet, but raise your hand to indicate what is most on your mind right now. Active learning, collaborative learning, or technology. So 1 finger for active learning, 2 for collaborative learning, and 3 for technology. Keep them up. Find a person you don't know, you haven't talked to, who has the same number of fingers in the air. Share one thing you want to try out, think about, learn more about, and then talk about what are your concerns with trying something like that. All right, find your person, talk about the one thing you want to try out, and what are your concerns. Let me just show you something about it. And that's why I need the microphone, right?
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's totally fine. This is what we did, right? We followed the learning cycle. I already told you that, so this is sort of a done deal. But also, I want to say, and this is something that James said earlier too. If you did any of these things, and someone did actually take a picture of the slide. Yes, I put that in there, and I said, I don't know if they're gonna, but here we go. If you did any of this, and I'm sure you did, then that also shows that you were engaged, not distracted, right? And I think to think that way about our students too. To give them the benefit of the doubt that what they're whispering might be related, actually, I think is a good start, right? All right, so that's it from me. Thank you. Feel free to reach out with questions, be it over coffee now, over email later. And I'm also doing a workshop for language programs specifically, so if you're teaching in a language, come tomorrow at 2:30 in Cobb. I would love to see you there. All right.
There is coffee and snacks in the back. Please feel free to eat them, converse with one another, converse with the presenters, as long as we're able to hang around. And thank you again for coming. Please be signing if you have not yet. All right. Thank you.